So here we are again with my grandmother Lois Griffiths, who was born in March of 1924 in Perth, Australia. This is the second video in a series. Today we're going to cover sort of the big major life events, talking about your life growing up in Perth and then the Great Depression and the Second World War, and then you moving out to the country and living on the farm. And then we'll talk about your son's involvement in the Vietnam War. And then we've got some questions that have been submitted from people who watched the last video, and so we'll ask some questions. And then next week we'll see whatever comes out from this session. Nan?
Okay, no worries.
Okay, wonderful. So Nanna, as I said, you were born in 1924 in Perth. So what was that like, Perth in 1920s?
I don't know about being born, how it was like in being born then. But I was brought into the world by my grandmother, who was a nurse, and it was in Enfield Street in Victoria Park. And I had 5 brothers and 2 sisters, but there was only one living then. My father was an ex-army bloke, and they'd come out from England in 1913 with my uncle, who was an ex-army bloke, and it was only a year after that he was called back to go when the war was on.
Okay.
Because he was in a mounted bizzo.
So do you know what brought your parents out to Australia?
For a better life.
For a better life.
And my mother, they didn't know whether to go to South Africa or to Australia, and she thought, well, they probably have Aboriginal servants out there. Yes, I'll go. And you said, my dad being an army man, she'd been used to having that sort of stuff, having done terms in India and Mauritius and all these places.
So it must have been quite a shock coming to Australia.
It was a shock, a great shock.
Yeah. And so, you went to school in Perth, Nan?
I went to school in South Perth School. And I used to have to walk past the zoo to go up to Forest Street Primary. And then I went on for first year at Perth Girls, which was the only high school in Perth. Everybody had to go that wanted a higher education.
Wow.
But when I was 14, my family decided to go across to Sydney.
Okay, let's go back just a little, because we'll come back to your move to Sydney. So the Great Depression came in 1929, so you would have been 5. So you wouldn't have necessarily remembered it itself, but do you remember how was your family?
I remember my brothers, even though they were professional men, they worked on farms for £2 a month, and they're bored, rather than put the stress on my dad and mother, because my father was retired, army bloke, on a pension, but he worked for the bank in St George's Terrace there, and he was, when it was first the Bank of Western Australia, and then it went to the Bank of New South Wales, and then of course it went to the Commonwealth Bank.
Yeah. So was he working for the bank when the Depression came? Or?
Yes, my dad was always through the bank, yeah.
Okay.
We didn't notice it as much as other families, but having adult brothers, they felt it more than, because my sister was married and with children. Because I'm only a year and 10 months older than my nephew. Which
nephew is that?
Vernon.
Oh,
he was a Commodore in the Navy when he died, yeah.
Okay, that's right. And so when the Depression came, Nan, did you still have presents? Do you remember much of what was happening?
I never got much presents at any time. I wouldn't have been of a depression, wouldn't have made any difference, because my mother didn't believe in it.
Really?
Yeah, I hung up my stocking at Christmas time. And all I got in it was, I used to have a kind of a red stocking with comics you'd never heard of and some lollies that were elsewhere. And I would get a pair of school shoes for next year.
Right. Oh, that's...
And when it come to Easter, the only Easter egg I ever got was when my birthday fell in Easter. But my mother got them.
Yeah.
Because my brothers used to buy them for my mother.
That's right. So Nan, so you were 14 when you moved to Sydney.
Yes.
With your family. So which members of your family went to Sydney and why?
We went over there because of my brother Ainsley,
Mm-hmm.
and there was Mum and Dad and Gordon and me,
Mm-hmm.
and the others stayed back in Western Australia because they all had their whatever they were doing. But my mother decided that it was time that she was always on the move.
Okay.
Having been in an army where they had a new posting every 2 years,
Mm-hmm.
we still carried on with that every 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Now, was her father in the army? Did she grow up?
Her father was
Yeah.
was in the army,
Mm-hmm.
and my grandmother's father was in the army.
Okay.
And I used to live not far from the old mill in South Perth,
Yes.
and unbeknownst to my mother,
Mm-hmm.
my brother Gordon and I, we swam the Narrows, which is full of sharks,
Mm-hmm.
over to Barrack Street Jetty and back again.
It's not that narrow, Nanna. I was there in January.
Oh, it's all changed now.
Yeah.
It was a spit of land.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't very far.
Okay. So you were 14 and you moved to Sydney. Did you go to school in Sydney?
No, my brother wanted me, because Dad was back then on a pension, and it was a bit hard having a school-aged child because all the others were all grown up, you see.
Mm-hmm.
And so my brother wanted me to go to school.
Mm-hmm.
And of all places, we were in King's Cross at Macleay Street there. We had a place there. It was very nice, actually. And my mother took me, and they transferred me, would you believe, to Glebe Point.
Right.
And it was very poor.
Yeah.
And my mother said, this is just a hovel, you're not going to school here.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, I don't care, I'll go to work anyway.
And is that when you got the job with the
I got the job
handkerchiefs?
with the sewing.
That's right. You said that last week. So Nanna, you moved to Sydney. What was King's Cross like in 1938? It's got an infamous
Well,
reputation.
we only stayed there for a week because my father got accosted going down the street by a streetwalker,
Right.
and he said, this is no place for me.
Mm-hmm.
And we moved straight away, and we went to McMahon's Point.
Okay. How long did you live there for?
I lived there right throughout the war years.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
I was married at Lavender Point Church.
Mm-hmm.
Lavender Bay, they called it.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Nan, you So you moved to Sydney in 1938, and the war broke out in 1939. Do you remember, how did you hear about the war, and what did you feel when you heard about it?
We were listening, yes. And my dad was very upset about it because he said it'll take the cream of our nation once again, and there's no winners in wars.
That's right. Because he was a war veteran himself,
Yes,
wasn't
he? He'd been in Afghanistan and all sorts with the Northumberland Fusiliers.
And he was in the Boer War?
He was in the Boer War, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And he was always an army man. Our house was run on army lights.
Yeah. And so you were still working at the sewing?
I didn't stay there long.
Okay, so where were you working
Then
by
I
then?
went, as I was the hostess Hushabye Dolls. I used to be the one that met everybody and sorted it all out and all that sort of stuff. Because I wasn't bad looking in those days, and that was in the Strand Arcade.
Mm-hmm.
Until the boss tried to put the hard word on me, and I told him where to go, and to remember that I had 5 brothers. So I did.
Did you quit, or did he say?
I quit. So I went out for lunch and didn't come back.
Good for you, Nan. And so Hushabye Dolls, you were...
I was a receptionist and used to meet the travellers and tell them all sorts of stuff and all that sort of thing. Yeah.
Okay.
Because I was rather older, coming from older parents for my years, and girls were older. But I was, as I belonged to the Girl Guides in South Perth, I was a patrol leader for them. I joined the Rangers in Sydney. Okay. And we used to be on roster, and when the war broke out, we would serve tea to any servicemen in Hyde Park.
Okay. And so how did the war impact your life? I mean, before you married Grams, but how did that impact your family and your day-to-day life, Nan?
Well, it was just that we were always saying goodbye to somebody in the family because my brother Len was in the engineers
Mm-hmm.
and he was on the first shipload to leave Perth to go to the Middle East.
Okay.
And that's because I was only 16 when I met Les, because the Perth had come in. It was on her when he went for it to be changed over from the Brits owning it and Australian government owning it.
Mm-hmm. That would be a lot for a 16-year-old to deal with, Nan, with constantly saying goodbye to her brothers to go to war.
Was always saying goodbye to somebody.
Yeah.
It was horrible really. But my mother was a very good soul that if she saw a serviceman down the street, she'd invite him home.
Mm-hmm.
We never knew how many would be staying the night or there, and I didn't take any notice of them anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Having 5 brothers, men didn't appeal to me whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
They were just there anyway.
Yeah. It's and then you lost one of your brothers in the war.
My brother Gordon, on the 24th of June 1944,
Mm-hmm.
was killed by the Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
The ship was HMAS Matafili,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a Burnsville Island ship,
Mm-hmm.
and they used to go through the islands.
Mm-hmm.
It was a Royal Australian Navy gun crew, and he was in charge of the 4-inch guns on it, and they used to have to be camouflaged.
Mm-hmm.
And they used to take supplies to the coast watchers.
Right.
And they went out from Townsville one day and they never come back. In fact, there's a memorial to the Matafili in Townsville.
I will have a look the next time I'm up there.
Mm.
And how did you find out that your brother was lost at sea?
But the telegram boy came to the door
Mm-hmm.
with the telegram for my mother.
Mm-hmm.
Your son's missing, believe killed.
And how old was he?
He was 23. He just had his 23rd birthday.
And
And he was the only closer one of the family because he was only 3 years older than me,
mm-hmm.
whereas the others were all like a lot of fathers.
Yeah. And so how did your mum and your dad?
My mother never got over it.
Mm-hmm.
She thought it was my eldest brother because he was in Kokoda,
Right.
and she thought
Oh,
it was,
so they didn't say which brother?
well, they just said your son,
Oh.
and she thought it was Ainsley,
Mm-hmm.
and when it was Gordon, her baby boy, she never got over it.
Really?
And she had able to buy a bottle of beer, and she kept it in the wardrobe all the war years because she was sure that he was alive and he was living on some island and he would come home.
Oh.
She always believed that he would come home.
And I remember you telling me once that she used to set a place for him at the table.
Oh yes, a place was set for him.
And how was that for you, Nan, having your mum constantly believe that?
Actually, it passed over me
Mm-hmm.
because I knew he would gone and I'd lost him.
Mm-hmm.
But I had so much to do.
Mm-hmm.
And
Because you were married with a
I was married
baby
when
by
I
that
was
stage.
17, so,
Yeah.
and I had less, and he was my main concern.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was just on 19 when I had my daughter, so.
Yeah.
that was it.
So.
And I was trying to feed her
Mm-hmm.
when the plane went over Bondi. I was having a glass of stout.
Now, for some people, because I only learnt about this recently myself, Nan, you need to tell what happened with the plane flying over the plane.
Well, it was a
flying over.
reconnaissance plane from a Japanese submarine that was off our coast.
Mm-hmm.
And they fired a shell,
Mm-hmm.
but people, they never got them, but they did find a sunken submarine off the coast many years later.
Really?
And they believed that was the one. And you see, the submarine came into Sydney Harbour.
Mm-hmm.
It got behind the wake of a ferry, and that's
Mm-hmm.
how there was a boom gate across the harbour,
Mm-hmm.
just before after the head, so that people come from Manly and they'd open the boom to let the ferry through.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they come in the wash of that,
Yeah.
and they were in Farm Cove,
Right.
and they sank the catapult which was an old ferry that the sailors used to stay on when they were getting rechanged, and it killed a few sailors that were there. And
Yeah, there's a memorial in Sydney for
yes.
that. Because I do remember reading that and seeing photographs that it had the submarine had actually shelled around Matraville and some of those lower eastern beaches, suburbs by
Bondi was the one mainly.
Yeah, yeah. So I do remember seeing that. Now, my other grandmother had told me that during the war, they had to, where she lived in Sydney, they had to block out the windows.
They had a brown out, and the windows, they got this black paint, and we had to paint all the windows. And all the street lights had a coping round them so that you could still see it down there, but people from above couldn't, and they had what they call the brown out. And
So what was the brownout?
The brownout was the street lights were there so that they could, from any plane going over, wouldn't have a good view of there. And we used to have the air raid siren went off.
Okay.
And one of the strangest one, Les was back after being in the Mediterranean, an evacuation of Greece and Crete. And this siren went off. And the next minute, I was in the gutter with him body covering mine, because that's what he was used to doing in the Middle East. Yeah.
Yeah, Gramps always put you first, Nan.
He was my protection. Yeah.
And he so being on the North Sydney side of the Harbour Bridge, where did you go? When the siren went off, where did you evacuate
We had to go into the middle. I lived in a block of what they were flats then, but they call them townhouses. And the walls of that place were about 3 foot thick. So in the middle of there, we all had to go downstairs and congregate in the foyer of that.
Okay.
building. Yes. But my brother Gordon was not very happy us living there. He used to say, and my father understood, he used to say, you shouldn't be here. You'd be in the direct fire of the ACAC guns on the pylon of the bridge. But you couldn't get accommodation.
Yeah. And did you work during the war?
Well, until I got married, I worked in a munitions factory, and it was the people that used to make Cyclop toys.
Really?
And they then went to these things, and I was an inspector of munitions.
Really?
Yes.
So you'd
And if
inspect them?
anything was faulty, I'd send it back.
Okay.
That's how I got the nickname of Hawkeyes. And this one young bloke, he said, it doesn't matter. I said, yes, it does. I said, one of my brothers might get that faulty thing, and I would have cost my brother's life. So it either goes out correct, and you do your job better.
And so where was that, Nan? Where was that job?
That was over in, I forget where it was, near the eastern suburbs, where Cyclops it was.
Okay, so you'd go across the bridge every day?
Yeah, ferry.
Oh, you'd catch the ferry every day?
From McMahon's Point, yes, it used to cost tuppence.
And did you ever feel a bit scared, or was it just life?
Just when we never thought that anybody could come in Sydney Harbour. We were above all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Is that because the war was so far away?
Yes, it was. Yes.
And then you married Gramps in the 12th
on the
December?
13th of December.
13th of December.
1942.
Yeah. And so, and he was in the Navy at the time?
Yes, he was a sailor. And he was invalided out of the Navy. And 2 weeks later, where he was walking in Martin Place, and some woman gave him a white feather, which they used to do for cowardice. And he was a good-looking young bloke. And they didn't realise that he'd been what he'd been. So he went around the corner and joined the AIF, and they never asked any questions because they knew he was a trained serviceman. And he was back over the Middle East where he'd been 6 months before.
So he left he was invalided out of the Navy, and then he went and joined the Army.
Yeah, AIF.
And
he was in the second field ambulance.
And he was invalided out because he. Why was Gramps invalided out, if you don't mind me asking?
What they call anxiety now, but he was blown up.
Okay.
In there when they were refuelling. And he had all sorts of issues bodily, and of course the stress of that gave him anxiety.
Yeah.
And they were very cruel in those days, and they're not much better to the servicemen now, for as far as anxiety is concerned. They sent him down to Goulburn, and they put electrodes on his head
Oh
and
dear.
gave him shock treatment.
Oh dear.
I had 2 children and that,
Yeah.
and he came back and he was rather pale,
Yeah.
and I just said to him, "Was it very bad, love?" And he said, "Well, I was lucky, Loy. I had you and the 2 children to think about." And he said, "And that's all I keep thinking about."
Yeah.
But he said the other poor devils had nobody and they all went troppo.
Yeah. Yeah. That's. Yeah. We still don't know how to deal with.
It's no
PTSD
better for
in our
these young
veterans.
blokes now. It is an illness that they've got to be treated as an illness.
Yeah. And so, I remember you telling me a story once, Nan, about how Gramps, when he was in the Navy, how Gramps swore at someone who was very
swore at
important.
the king.
The king of the British Empire.
British Empire.
Tell me about that, Nan.
Well, you see, he was over the side, and they were in the Mediterranean, and they only had 2 ships there, and one was Australian and one was New Zealand. And these 2 ships had to be running around and get their picture taken by the recce pilot, and to do that, they'd put up a false funnel today and take that down, and then they'd change the camouflage and so on to make it look as though there was more than 2 ships there. And this fellow put his head over the side and he said, "What are you doing?" And without looking up, your grandfather said, "What do you think of bloody hell I'm doing?" And the king, who could swear like a trooper himself, he says, "Ask a silly bloody question and get a silly bloody reply." But then he also turned to the commander of the ship that was there, and don't crime that man, because otherwise he would have spent 2 days in the clink. He'd just come out of spending 2 days in the clink because the commander's wife had come aboard at Garden Island, and he was on top of the gangway, and you know gangways float around and do all sorts of things, and it was rather high, and he put his hand out for this woman to help her down as a gentleman should, and she brushed his hand away, stepped off and fell on her face, so he laughed. So he had 2 days in the brig.
Yeah. So he was and he was medalled in the Navy. He was that in the army that he got his medals?
No, he got his usual medals that everybody else got. He got nothing extra. But and I've got them there now, and I wore them this last Anzac Day.
Yeah, for Anzac Day. So you married Gramps, and he and you had 2 children, and he'd come home from the Navy, and then a lady had called him a coward, and he'd gone to enlist in the army. When he came home to tell you, what happened there?
Well, he just looked at me, he said, "I'm sorry, love, but this has happened and I couldn't help myself." And I said, "Well, you are a man of your own decisions. There be it."
Yeah. And he he fought. Where did he see it?
Well, he was in the. He'd fought in the in the Navy. He'd been in the evacuation of Greece and Crete, and in the Mediterranean there. And then when he went back over again, he was in the North African with the Australian Army attached to the British 8th Army, and that's what his medals say.
So he didn't fight on Kokoda or in New Guinea or?
No, he was going up there and he was invalided out. But and it was just as well actually, because the group that he was with, they were the first lot to go into Singapore, and he would have spent his time there. And that's one of the things that I was pleased about of my brother dying, because he was one of those that if he saw somebody being ill-used, he would have jumped in to defend them.
Yeah.
And so it probably would have ended up being beheaded anyway, because that's what the Japanese used to do.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I was very proud of my husband. We were on a trip north when we lived in Sydney, a trip there, and for some odd reason, this young Japanese fellow took a shine to us. So I was in the middle, and your grandfather one side, and this Japanese boy was on the other.
This would have been in the 80s?
Yeah, it was when we still lived in Sydney after the kids had grown up.
Yep.
And he was on a year's trip around from Japan. And then it came, we used to have a pet saying, ice cream needed. And we were going past this place, and Les said, ice cream needed. So I thought, this is going to be a bit difficult. But he came out with 3 ice creams. And he gave one to this young man.
Yeah.
And I said to him, I'm pleased about that. And he said, well, it's like this, Loy. The war's been over for a long time. And I would hope if one of my grandchildren it would be met with the same in Japan. And he said, this young lad is not responsible for what his grandfather said.
Yeah. Yeah. I've always been really proud of my gramps for that.
Yes, he was one of those, yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, and I often think about that, Nan. I have a couple of friends in Japan. And I often think about how gramps really epitomised forgiveness. But on the other hand, I always wanted to go to Japan because I wanted to see the cherry blossom. And he said, Loy, I can't go. Yeah.
And the same as when we came through Singapore. Everybody went to Changi prison to have a look. He said, I can't go. He said, too many of my people I knew ended there.
Yeah, after I visited Auschwitz, I knew I could never go and see any more war prisons or anything like that.
And the same as we've got a war memorial out of Darwin. It came down. It's on the south Alligator River or something. And I went there.
Yeah.
And I saw all these memorials to our servicemen. They'd been at Darwin and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I couldn't go again because there was young men, 22. My darling daddy was. It just could not happen.
Yeah, the Commonwealth. Did you go to the Commonwealth War cemeteries in the Fromelles in France when you were there?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, that's.
That's. I only went to one.
Yeah.
And it was too hard on your grandfather.
Yeah. Yeah, it brings tears to my eyes.
No, it couldn't.
Whenever
Can't happen. Yeah.
Yeah. And so so your husband was invalided out, and you were in the war, and you were still living with 2 children with your parents?
Yes, because there's no accommodation, you see. And then Les put in for a ballot because they thought he would be better off in the country. And he won this land at Nangus for war servicemen they had there.
And that was after the war?
After the war.
So just before we go into your life at Nangus, Nan, I just want to ask you, how did you find out about the end of the war? And what did you do when you finally found out that victory... Well, actually, there were 2 ends. You know, when it had ended in Europe in the May, and then when it had ended in the Pacific in the October. How did...
Well, the first one in May in Europe didn't mean much to me because my people were up north. And I just think, I hope to God that none of them will get killed between the time that it's finally over and they're all home safely.
Yeah.
Because you see, with the exception of my brother Reuben, who was in munitions, the same place where he was the manager of that, and they wouldn't take him because he was in this protected industry. All the others, even my brother Arthur, our people wouldn't accept him, but the Americans did, and he was with the American small ship.
Really? It's funny, we've all ended up with American connections with every generation. Auntie Elaine's an American, and I'm a year away from becoming an American. And so...
And I have an American grandchild, Elaine's acquired children. Yeah. And she rings me occasionally from America, and she's always on the computer.
Yeah.
Julia.
Yeah, they're a lovely family. And so so Victory Pacific came. It's October 1945. How did you hear about it, and what did you go and do?
Didn't do anything special.
No.
Just the same thing, because when it came to the Pacific, we were so matter of fact about these things. That, oh yeah, when it happens, it'll happen. Don't believe it until it's a foregone conclusion.
So then Gramps put in for the ballot and he got some land down near
Yes,
Nangus,
that's right, yes.
which is near Gundagai in the Southern Highlands.
Nangus was 14 kilometres out of Gundagai, which was about 45 miles out of Wagga.
Right, okay. So down towards Canberra, well, past Canberra if you're coming from Sydney. Now, you'd never lived on a farm, had you, Nan?
I was a city girl. And it was an experience for me to not to have a flush toilet.
Oh, you had a thunderbox?
Yeah, we had a thunderbox. And when we went first there, it was a strange thing. As you know, you're quite an old grandfather. And he went first to get us accommodation, and he was able to get us on the main homestead station. It was a shearer's hut. So we got it there, and then he said to the lady post office, who was a busybody, but she was a very kind lady. And we came down on the train, and he mentioned about me, but he didn't tell this poor lady that he had 2 children. So when we came in on the bus, she came and she said, oh well. And when we were going to bed, she said, don't worry if you hear the patter of little feet. Les and I looked at each other, and that expression was when you had little children. And he said, she's a bit old for pattering, and I said, yes. So that was him. So we put the children in the bed that she'd made up there, and we went out. She said, I've made you up a bed on the veranda. So
was it summertime?
Pardon?
Was it summertime? Because it's cold down there in
Yes,
winter.
it was. It was whatever.
Yeah.
And every time there was a patter of feet, I'd sit up, bolt upright in the bed, and your grandfather would pat me down and say, oh, it's all right, love. Anyway, come daylight, and there was a hell of a noise on the back veranda. She had put us in a bed that was usually the roosting place for the chooks and the ducks and everything else, and we had all these things all running all over us. But then we went up on the shearer's cottage, and we were very happy there until our own house was built, which Les built. And after School of the Air, every day for Graham and Elaine, I used to put them in a horse and dray that had been loaned to me by one of the locals, take the lunch down, and we would sit and have lunch with Les and do any bits about the place. But that horse, it was a poor old draft horse, and I used to flog that thing to make it go. But that was what we first did at Nangus. And of course, Elaine was school age, and she was supposed to have been going to school, but that's why she listened to School of the Air.
Do you know it still runs, Nan? School of the Air still runs.
Goes, yes, that's right.
I spent some time consulting to Department of Education in 2018, and School of the Air, it's run out of Surrey Hills.
Yes, well, they were those people, because the soldier settlers, we had very nice friends with the other soldier settlers. But these people there, they'd been in and they were like a hillbilly thing. That bar and park kettle was felt quite attributed to those kind of people.
So, Nan, there was a lady who had a very colourfully painted house. I remember you telling me in Nangus.
Oh yes, she did. She used to paint it, and she always had to keep up with the Joneses. And if you got a new fridge, the next thing she would have a new fridge. But she was a very kind lady, and their name was Webster's. And they had children comparable to mine. So she didn't believe in education, but I used to give her youngest education lessons over in my house, so that at least he wouldn't grow up ratbag and all the rest of the jazz. Yes.
Now, was she the one that had all the panels painted in different colours?
Oh no, that was Mrs. Gordon, the lady at the post office.
Okay.
And she had curtains to match, and if it was the pink day, she'd have pink curtains up and pink wall, and she'd do another panel. It was all fibro, you see. And she used to paint them according to the mood. And we learnt never to buy anything that needed handling, like biscuits were out of a tin. You didn't get them in a packet in those days, or that, because she would come in after crutching a sheep with all sheep poos on her fingers, and if you want some biscuit, yes dear.
Oh dear.
And so it went on.
Now, was that the same lady who used her gloves to pick up the cow pats?
Yes. And we had the governor come, because we're soldier settlers, you see, and the governor came down to give us, and she was round the paddock where they were going to be, and she had these white gloves on, and she was picking up the cow pads because she thought they might be offensive to the governor. Then she shook his hand with the same gloves. And then we had one fellow that was very shy, and so he was, well, not too bob in the pound short, I would say. And he wanted to meet the governor, but he went up a tree instead.
Yeah.
And the tree was the one that the governor stood underneath, and he fell out of the tree at his feet. There were some very funny things there.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's and how did you? I mean, now, did you? Because you'd never learnt to drive or anything, like so.
No.
So how did? What happened being out on the farm?
Les said to me, I used to leapfrog round the paddock, and he said, you will have to. We had a 100-weight truck then. And he said, I'm going to spread the super today, and you'll have to drive. I said, me drive? He said, you've been sitting there long enough, you should be able to drive. So he was on the back, spreading super, and he never told me, for instance, that you should put the clutch in before you put it on the brake, and he said, stop. So I stopped and shot him off the back and the back wheel.
And the back wheel.
And the back wheel went off, and he picked himself up. He says, oh, well, better next time, love.
Yeah.
And then it was only about a week later, he said, I've baled some lucerne down the lucerne paddock, he said, and I've got to load it to stack it. So he said, you can drive the truck. Oh, well, here we go again. So he said, you idle. Never told me how to idle. So I was idling all right. He was putting them on one side and I was shooting them off the other.
And so eventually you did get your licence though.
Yes, but we never bought anything in Gundagai. It was too dear, so we used to go to Wagga once a week.
And that was, you said, 45 miles?
So, and the kids knew every tree on the way in there because they used to whittle behind every tree that we went. It used to take us for ages to get there.
Well, that's
there
like,
was
what,
a bus
70
there.
kilometres?
Pardon?
That's like 70, sorry, Nan, I didn't grow up with imperial measurements. I'm like, it's like 70 odd kilometres, Nan.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Elaine went there every day to school when later on. But anyway, I used to go into Wagga to do the shopping and leave. Junee I used to go the shopping, not Wagga. And there was a policeman there that had taken the place of our lovely sergeant who used to be in there, and this one had been a cyclist copper, hated because he used to hide behind trees and jump out. Anyway, I used to leave the car outside of Junee, do the shopping, and then go and drive home without a licence. So this one particular time I had to go to the hospital with Graham. He wasn't very well and there was no local doctor, that's where you went. And you had to go to the police station to get a licence. So I rolled up to the police station to get a licence. And this bloke looked at me and he said, Mrs. Griffiths, the lady that leaves her car on the outside of the town and walks in. So he said, I know what you can do. But he took me in every hill climb in Junee, which is quite a hilly town. On every hill start, 3-point turns on impossible roads. He tried everything. And he said, I knew it was a waste of time. I knew you couldn't. So he said, now, that truck that you drive without a licence to this, you will come and do the same thing tomorrow, which I did. And got it. Then I had to answer all the questions in the book. And I answered every one. He said, how come you know all these questions? So I said, well, I've got them pinned up on the curtain over where I do the washing up. And he said, well, I suppose you must do a hell of a lot of washing up because you've got them all right. So he never ever, he used to wave at me afterwards.
And was Dad born by that stage?
Pardon?
Was it just the 2 children, or did you have...
I had the Graham and Elaine.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
And you...
See, Greg was there
Mm-hmm.
later on, but he was born in Gundagai.
Yeah.
Mm.
And the farm was called Grella?
Yes, and that was made up of our names.
Mm-hmm.
GR for Graham,
Mm-hmm.
EL for Les,
Mm-hmm.
and IS for Elaine and me.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's
Lovely.
how the name came.
And so, how long were you on the farm? So you moved there
10 years. We were 10 years on the farm,
Okay.
and then your grandfather got too ill.
Mm-hmm.
All his things were getting, and he used to spend more time in the Wagga Base Hospital than he was out. And it was getting very difficult for me to be running a farm,
Yeah.
going to spending a time with him and having children at home.
Yeah.
And also, it doesn't sound much, but it was costing threepence a pound on the old monies
Mm-hmm.
to produce the wool and the return.
Mm-hmm.
And if you sold your wheat to the silo,
Mm-hmm.
they never gave you the full price then. They would pay 1/6 a bushel over a period of 5 years.
Oh my lord. So I remember, Nan, just coming back, because we've touched on Gramps' illnesses.
Mm.
When the war came to an end, you were told by the military doctor, or towards the war, that Gramps wouldn't live.
Yes, when he was invalided out the last time,
Mm-hmm.
they called me in, and I never ever told Les.
Mm-hmm.
And they said there was this three or four of these old bods, too old to do anything anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Should have been retired off many years before. But anyway, they just said, put your affairs in order,
Mm-hmm.
because in our opinion, your
Mhm.
husband only has 3 years to live.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I had 2 children. I
Mhm.
was 22 and he was 26.
Mm-hmm.
And never been short of words.
Mm-hmm.
I turned round and said to these old stagers, since when can you play God?
Mm-hmm.
So they said, it's your hands. So my hands must have been pretty good, because he was 88 when he died.
That's right. That's 12 years next
It's
month.
12 years on the 20th of May,
Yeah.
2 days after your dad's birthday.
Yeah, Dad. We actually, in Mum and Dad's dining room, they still have his
I was
funeral
glad
program.
it was after, because I was afraid. I knew we knew he was dying, and it was time for him to go as
It
well.
was.
He was in agony and paralysed,
Yeah.
and he couldn't speak.
Yeah, I remember the last time I saw him, I was about to move to London.
Mm.
And I put it off, and I remember you saying to me, darling, say your goodbyes, and you've got to live your life, and, you know, and move to London.
Mm.
And I'd only been in London for about 2 or 3 weeks when he died.
But we had a funny thing when we went to Western Australia.
Mm-hmm.
His dad was dying from
Mhm.
miners' complaint. He lived
Mhm.
in Southern Cross with my
Mhm.
who I had the mother-in-law from hell.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, Les wanted for his father, who he was very like. He was a Welshman,
Mm-hmm.
and he wanted his dad to meet his wife and 2 children.
Mm-hmm.
So over we go. Graham wasn't quite 12 months old,
Mm-hmm.
and Elaine was a little 2 and something.
Mm-hmm.
And we got off the train, and those days each state had a different gauge, so you'd have
Mhm.
to change whatever.
Mm-hmm.
We finally got there, and the poor old man, because he had miners' complaint, this witch of a woman kept him out on the veranda in a banana chair.
Oh, Lordy.
I was never introduced to him or anything, no one there.
Wow.
And Graham, as a 12 months old, he was just not quite 12 months old, was
Mhm.
jabbering on.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, this mother-in-law of mine, why don't you teach your child to speak plain English? Now, Bubby's of that age.
Yeah.
So I just said, it's the foreign blood coming out in him. And she flew. I didn't know you had any foreign blood. I said, I haven't got it, but Les has.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, Les? I said, yes, it's the Welsh.
Mm-hmm.
And the old bloke said, and then he said to Les, I've met your wife now and your 2 children,
Mhm.
and you've done well for yourself, son. Go back to the eastern states. get the hell out of it, because she will make your life as big a misery as she's made everybody else's.
Yeah. Well, when I come back next week, now we'll have a chat about a little bit about what you know of Gramps' upbringing and his family and those sorts of things, and you know, when he got his license and some of those things. But I want to move on now, Nan, to, and because I have had you talking for a long time. Nana, I want to move on to just because I said I'd talk briefly about the Vietnam War. Now you know, your eldest son went off to fight in the Vietnam
Yes, he
War.
did.
And
we used to get calls at night time.
Mm-hmm.
You better take out insurance because you know he's coming back, because Graham was well known.
Mm-hmm.
He'd been the school head prefect of the high school.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody knew him, and he was a fantastic footballer and all
Mm-hmm.
that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to get, and I just said one night, I said to this bloke that rang up, "You'll get a visit from a bloke with a white coat because you need to be put away." And I blew a whistle in his ear, and
Good
he
on you, Nan.
never worried me anymore. And then I used to get freedom singers
Mm-hmm.
out on the front lawn.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, I'm proud of my son.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't ask to go there. He's a
Mhm.
regular army, and he had to go.
Mm-hmm.
And the police looked after us
Mhm.
because we come under surveillance of the police.
Mm-hmm.
So when this lot came the last time,
Mm-hmm.
I went and clapped my hands.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, feel free to come and sing any time you like. I've quite enjoyed your chorus and your singing to
Mhm.
me. They never came back.
Now, because you had 3 sons, or was Uncle Mick of age? By the end, he would have been of age.
He was born in 1955.
So, now, given that you had 4 sons and one of them was already fighting in Vietnam, and
Yeah.
Australia introduced conscription, were you worried about your other 3 sons?
Well, Graham, as you know, went to Vietnam 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
And he always said, I'd go the 4th time if it would save baby brothers there, because he was an instructor. And his proudest thing was the group of blokes he took over. He brought them all back alive.
Yeah.
And that's when he got the military medal for bravery,
Yeah.
because he stood out and took the fires when his men got cut off.
Yeah.
And you know, I was talking to a bloke in the bank in Brookvale,
Mm-hmm.
and I was doing banking for Graham, and this fellow said he'd done he was been a birthday boy and he was back,
Mm-hmm.
and he said, "Oh, Griffiths," he said, "you know, there's a bloke out there." He said, "All of us would go to hell and back for that bloke," and kept on. It was Graham, and I said,
Oh.
and I said, "Thank you for that." I said, he's as good a son as he is a soldier.
It's lovely, Nan.
Mm.
I see you have his photograph with his medals and
And wearing his dad's as well.
yeah, and you've got photographs of Gramps with his medals.
Mm.
What I want to do now, Nan, is because again, I am going to come back and talk to you about things, but there have been some questions that have been sent in, Nan.
Mm.
So Arnie Marie has asked, or has asked about the paper house that Gramps built.
Oh yes, well when we went to the farm,
Mm-hmm.
that Les got bright idea, and Graham knows about this, and we were
Mhm.
living in the sharers' cottage and that.
Mm-hmm.
He built a shed,
Mm-hmm.
and he made the walls, which was malthoid really, it wasn't really, it was a kind of a bitumen on paper,
Mm-hmm.
and he thought we could live in it.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't work, did it?
Mm-hmm. No. And so I should identify the questions now. So, an Elaine from Deception Bay has asked about Dina the draft horse.
Well, that's what I was talking.
Okay.
Yeah, that was when I used to put them in the dray and take them down to their father who was building the house. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now.
And we had on our farm we had a cattle horse,
Mm-hmm.
and it was Peanut,
Mm-hmm.
and it could only do 1 speed,
Mm-hmm.
fast and faster. And apart from Les, the only person that could ride it was Elaine.
Mm-hmm. Now I see that Uncle Graham's asked about the local school and the dead sheep. Do you know that story? Because Dad tells it to me.
Oh, there's always somebody's dead, as a
Yeah, that's...
well, you see, also,
Mm-hmm.
as I had the gun and I used to shoot off and all
Mm-hmm.
that, and Les not being there because I had to learn to shoot, and if a sheep, and I went past in the wool, sometimes it would fall down and then the crows would pick its eyes or its tongue out.
Mm-hmm.
But this particular time,
Mm-hmm.
I was firing off at the chook shut because we had foxes there.
Mm-hmm.
And when I went to look at it, I'd split the handle on a hammer that was standing on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, this beautiful sheep in full wool had slowly dropped to the ground. And Les paid £600 for this sheep. And I thought, oh my God,
Yeah.
I've shot the sheep.
Yeah.
But it was only because it was too heavy and wool and it couldn't get, once it got down, it couldn't get up.
Now, Nan, I remember you, I remember you telling me how you used to do fancy dress costumes for all the children at school.
Yes, I did.
And then they tried to ban your children.
Yes, they did.
Would you tell me
Well, you
about
see,
that?
making costumes, I used to say when I was a child, I'd like to go fancy dress ball, and my mother used to say, of course you can go, make your own costume and get yourself there.
Mm-hmm.
So it taught me independence.
Mm-hmm.
And we used to go down in Nangus, they used to have balls and all the rest of the jazz.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to make sure that the children, they
Mhm.
always got, because they never knew. So much so I heard a local said, we're going to get, one of these times, we're going to get these, Griffiths kids aren't going to win.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh, I overheard it, you see.
Mm-hmm.
So there was Greg. First of all, I had, what was it, Elaine
Mm-hmm.
with Beverly
Mm-hmm.
in a pram, an old pram, and I'd put a sack on and all that. And
Mhm.
I put a huge big dummy on Beverly's face made
Mhm.
out of and Elaine was dressed up as a boy.
Mm-hmm.
And then it wasn't Elaine, it was Graham, I think. Graham was dressed up.
Mm-hmm.
And he had black wavy hair, so I put one of my hats on
Mm-hmm.
and put the band round the back so you wouldn't see he had short back and sides.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my dresses on him, and he strolled through.
Mm-hmm.
And then Greg and David was St George and the Dragon.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one, the other little one, was a bumblebee.
Mm-hmm.
Was it David? No, he was a bumblebee. Anyway,
Yep.
I had all these costumes, all
Mhm.
that there. And then they all won prizes, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Graham took off his, because this bloke came up to me that was so against us winning. And he said, that person pushing that stroller,
Mm-hmm.
I've seen her around sometime. And I
Mhm.
thought, oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So when Graham, and they said, well, you can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
And then we went to Mona Vale in Park Street,
Mm-hmm.
and the children there, their mothers wouldn't be bothered. So I made all the costumes for
Yeah.
them, and I got a prize from the local, I suppose it was some like a TAFE or something,
Mm-hmm.
for the best colour coordination for the
Oh,
the
no.
costumes.
Some of the costumes you've made me over the years and the birthday
But you
cakes.
see, I
and-
had a flair for it.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
More than a flair, man. You had a
Mm.
Nowadays, you'd be you'd be a YouTuber with all of your costumes, Nan. So I have a question from Melissa in Alexandria, asking: is it true that Gramps was on steroids to do track and field?
No, that came to me.
Mm-hmm.
I was here,
Mm-hmm.
and they were saying, you know, about sports. Somebody was here,
Mm-hmm.
and I was one of them. I think they went on. I forget which one it was now.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, you know, I was going to go. I said I was going to get ready for the Olympics.
Mm-hmm.
And look at me. Oh, this is only not such a, be about 20 years ago. I'll still be a pretty old bird.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, the Olympics. I said, I'm training.
Mm-hmm.
So they said, what are you training for? I said, field. And heard a field, you know, a field and track.
Mm-hmm.
So they said, well, what's your best one? I said, hurdling, of course. And this bloke like really believed it. And he said, fancy. And I thought, I've never heard of him.
Mm-hmm.
That was what that was all about, yeah.
Yeah, well, and it looks like you'll have a granddaughter that's an Olympian. If I said you may have a granddaughter that's an Olympian, if we're all lucky.
Yeah, well, if they keep on turning it up, she'll be getting past the pool too. But
Yeah.
yes.
And my last question, Nana, is from an anonymous person who wanted to remain anonymous. Who's your favourite grandchild?
I haven't got a favourite. I love them all. I love them all. They've all. I'm not unaware of their failings, and I've got failings too.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't be human if they didn't have it.
Yeah, that's right, Nan. Look, I'm going to, because I've kept you talking for nearly an hour, Nan, so I thank you for that. So again, I'm going to put this up on YouTube, and after this I'll set you up so you can watch last week's video on your computer, and I'll come back next week, and next week we'll ask a lot more about the family and things like that and life in
No
Sydney.
problem.
Okay, Nan, thank you so much.
Oh, it was my pleasure.